The first day at a new job is always a mix of excitement and nervousness. For him, it felt even more complicated because he wasn't just any employee. He was the son of the CEO, yet he had made a conscious decision not to reveal it. He wanted to experience the company from the ground level, to see how things really worked, how employees were treated, and whether the office environment was as professional as people claimed. He walked into the building early in the morning, dressed in plain work attire. The lobby was busy with employees greeting each other, some rushing to meetings, others chatting casually. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of polished floors and paper. He took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. Today, he was just another worker. As he approached the reception, a friendly receptionist smiled at him. "Good morning." "First day?" she asked. He nodded, trying to smile back without looking too nervous. She handed him a badge and a schedule for orientation. "Don't worry, it's a bit overwhelming at first, but you'll get used to it." He made his way to the department where he would be working. The office was open plan, filled with rows of desks, computers, and people typing away or talking quietly on phones. He noticed the subtle hierarchy in the office. Some desks were neatly organized with personal items, while others were cluttered and messy. He assumed the neat desks belonged to senior employees, and the messy ones to new hires, or lower-level staff. He was introduced to his team. Most of them nodded politely, but he could sense some skepticism in their eyes. They didn't know him yet, and he didn't know them. The manager, a man named Dalton, was brisk and strict. From the moment he entered, Dalton's presence filled the room. He had a sharp voice and a look that suggested he didn't tolerate mistakes. Dalton didn't bother to smile. He just gave a short nod before moving on. Evan, as he was called by his coworkers, tried to blend in. He quietly set up his workspace, arranging his notepad, pen, and laptop. He wanted to appear focused and ready, but he also wanted to observe. From his seat, he could see the dynamics of the team. Some employees seemed afraid to speak up, while others were confident but careful not to attract Dalton's attention by mid-morning. Dalton started giving instructions. "We have a lot of work today. I don't want excuses. If you can't handle your tasks, tell me now so I can assign someone else." His tone was sharp, bordering on rude. Several employees nodded silently, obviously intimidated. When he got to Evan, he paused and looked him up and down. "You're new. Don't expect me to go easy on you." Evan nodded, keeping his voice calm. Understood. He didn't flinch. He knew that overreacting or showing fear would only give Dalton more reason to bully him. Instead, he decided to focus on his work and let his actions speak for themselves. The morning passed slowly. Dalton frequently walked around the office, checking on employees, often making critical comments. "That report is sloppy. Fix it. Why is this late? Do it properly next time, or there will be consequences." Evan noticed how the comments were harsher towards some employees than others. There was a clear pattern. Dalton seemed to target those he considered weaker or less confident. During lunch, Evan sat quietly in the cafeteria. He observed the way employees interacted. Some tried to avoid Dalton, taking their meals in silence, while others whispered about the unfair treatment, but didn't speak up in front of him. One employee, who had been at the company for a few years, glanced at Evan and said softly, "Don't let him get to you. He treats everyone badly, but he's worse if he thinks you're vulnerable." Evan nodded, appreciating the advice, but choosing not to reveal anything about himself in the afternoon. Dalton assigned Evan a difficult task. It was something most new employees would struggle with, but Evan approached it methodically. He broke it down step by step, making notes and checking details carefully. Dalton watched over him, occasionally making snide comments. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, smirking. Evan didn't respond aggressively. He just continued working, letting his confidence and calmness speak for him. By the end of the day, Evan had completed the task efficiently, even adding a few suggestions to improve the process. Dalton glanced at it, raising an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Not bad," he muttered. It wasn't praise, but it was more than Evan expected. He packed his things quietly, leaving the office without drawing attention, Walking out of the building, Evan reflected on the day. It had been challenging, but he had learned a lot. He had seen how power and authority could be abused, how fear influenced people's behavior, and how important it was to remain composed under pressure. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, and Dalton's true nature would likely become more evident over time as he drove home. He thought about the employees who had been quietly suffering under Dalton's management. He felt a sense of responsibility not as the CEO's son yet, but as someone who now had first-hand insight into the workplace reality. He wanted to see change, but he also knew he needed patience and strategy. Acting too soon or revealing his identity could backfire. For now, observation and understanding were the keys. That night, he reviewed his notes and reflected on every interaction. He thought about how Dalton singled him out, how other employees reacted, and how fear and respect were often confused in the office. He realized that this job was more than just a work assignment. It was a lesson in human behavior, power dynamics, and patience. Evan also reminded himself why he had chosen this path. He wanted to understand the company from the inside. Not as a CEO's son who could command respect, but as a regular employee who needed to earn it. He wanted to see the truth behind the polished image of the company and ensure that everyone was treated fairly. Before going to bed, he made a plan for the next day. He would continue to observe Dalton, support his colleagues quietly, and handle his tasks efficiently. He knew that sooner or later, the truth about his identity might come out. And when it did, he wanted to ensure it had the maximum positive impact for the employees. For now, he focused on the small victories, the successful completion of tasks, small gestures of kindness to his coworkers, and maintaining his composure under pressure. It was the first day. And while it had been exhausting, it had also been enlightening. Evan felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Tomorrow, he would face Dalton again, and perhaps the challenges would be even greater. But he was ready. He knew that understanding, patience, and resilience would be his strongest tools as he navigated the complex world of office politics. Hidden biases and the true test of character that lay ahead. As he drifted to sleep, Evan felt a quiet determination. He had stepped into a world where appearances could be deceiving, where authority could be misused, and where courage was often quiet and unseen. Tomorrow would be another day, but he was prepared to face it, knowing that every experience would bring him closer to understanding the people around him and the changes he hoped to see. The first day had ended, but the journey had just begun. The second day at the office felt heavier than the first. He arrived earlier than usual, wanting to prepare himself mentally for whatever challenges awaited. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed the usual morning bustle, employees chatting in small groups, the soft hum of computers, and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the cafeteria. But there was something different today. Dalton was already at his desk, tapping on the keyboard with a sharp, impatient rhythm. The manager's glare swept across the room as if searching for mistakes before they even happened. Evan walked to his desk, trying to ignore Dalton's piercing stare. He had learned that showing fear only made Dalton bolder. Today, he wanted to observe not just Dalton's behavior, but also how his coworkers responded. There was a subtle tension in the air. Some employees hurried past Dalton, avoiding eye contact. Others tried to appear busy, their fingers flying across keyboards, hoping to appear indispensable. Evan quietly sat down, opening his notepad and laptop. He didn't want to stand out unnecessarily, but he also didn't want to be invisible. Dalton's voice cut through the office like a whip. "I hope everyone is ready today because we have deadlines to meet. No excuses, no mistakes. If you can't handle your work, let me know now so I can assign someone who can." His tone was cold, leaving no room for discussion. He stopped briefly at Evan's desk, scrutinizing him. "You don't think you're going to get special treatment because you're new? Keep up, or you'll fall behind." Evan nodded calmly, keeping his composure. He had learned that patience was his strongest weapon. The morning dragged on. Dalton was relentless, moving from desk to desk, criticizing employees for minor errors. "This is unacceptable," he snapped at one employee. "Do it over and make it right." When he reached Evan again, he leaned slightly over his desk. I expect perfection. Don't waste my time. Evan looked up, meeting Dalton's gaze without flinching. Understood, he said quietly. Dalton smirked, perhaps thinking he had intimidated him. But Evan felt no fear. Around mid-morning, Evan noticed a small group of employees whispering in the corner. Their expressions were tense. He realized they were discussing Dalton, sharing experiences of unfair treatment and subtle humiliations. One of them glanced at him and whispered, "Be careful. Dalton doesn't just push you, he tests you." Dalton's attention was drawn to a minor error in a report submitted by another employee. His voice rose sharply, echoing across the office. "How could you be so careless? This is basic work. Do it again properly, or I'll make sure everyone knows about your incompetence." The employee shrank back, muttering apologies. Evan noticed the fear in their eyes, the way they avoided Dalton's gaze, and how even small mistakes could provoke severe reactions. It was a cruel pattern, and it disturbed him. Evan's own work demanded focus. Dalton had assigned him a challenging project, a set of detailed calculations and reports that required precision and patience. He methodically went through each step, making notes and double-checking his work. Dalton hovered nearby, occasionally making comments like, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Or "I don't want mistakes on my desk." Evan remained composed, answering briefly when necessary, and letting his work speak for itself. By lunchtime, the tension had grown noticeably. Dalton had singled out a few employees for minor errors, criticizing them harshly. Evan observed how the others reacted. Some tried to console their colleagues quietly, while others avoided eye contact, too afraid to get involved. It was clear that Dalton's behavior affected not only the targets, but also the entire atmosphere of the office. Everyone was on edge, tiptoeing around his moods. In the cafeteria, Evan found a quiet corner and ate his lunch while observing his surroundings. A few employees sat nearby, whispering about Dalton's unfair treatment. One woman, clearly frustrated, said softly, "He treats us like children. No matter how well we do, he finds something wrong." Another employee added, "I've seen him treat some people with respect, but only if he thinks they can benefit him somehow. The rest of us are just expendable." Evan listened carefully, internalizing their experiences without commenting. He understood that patience and observation were crucial. He wanted to make a difference. The afternoon brought an even bigger challenge. Dalton assigned Evan a new task, more complicated than the one from the previous day. It required not just skill, but creative thinking and problem-solving. Evan approached it systematically, breaking it down into smaller steps. Dalton watched over his shoulder, making occasional remarks, sometimes critical, sometimes incredulous at Evan's calm and confident approach. "You're new. You shouldn't be doing this yet," Dalton said sharply. Evan didn't respond with words but continued working diligently. As he progressed, other employees started to notice. Evan's calmness and competence contrasted sharply with Dalton's harshness. Some glanced at him with admiration, others with quiet hope that maybe someone could stand up to Dalton without fear. Evan was aware of their glances, but focused on the task, knowing that consistency and patience were his best allies. Halfway through the afternoon, Dalton's temper flared over a minor mistake made by another employee. His voice rose again, sharp and cutting. "I can't believe this. How many times do I have to tell you? Pay attention." The employee looked down, embarrassed and fearful. Evan felt a pang of sympathy. He understood that Dalton's behavior wasn't just about mistakes. It was about control and intimidation. He quietly thought about ways to help the team without drawing Dalton's ire. As the day continued, Evan made small efforts to support his coworkers subtly. When someone struggled with a task, he offered a discreet tip or a quick suggestion without attracting Dalton's attention. It was a delicate balance, helping others without being noticed by the manager. Slowly, a sense of quiet trust started to develop. Some employees began looking at him for guidance, though cautiously, afraid that Dalton might misinterpret their interactions. Dalton, of course, remained skeptical. He noticed Evan's calm demeanor and efficient work, but could not understand why this new employee seemed unaffected by his harshness. He questioned him repeatedly, sometimes unnecessarily, trying to provoke a reaction. Each time, Evan responded politely and calmly, completing his tasks efficiently. Dalton's frustration grew, but Evan never showed fear or anger. He knew that remaining composed was essential. By the end of the day, Evan had completed all his assignments ahead of schedule, and even identified a few areas where processes could be improved. Dalton glanced over his work, clearly impressed despite himself. "Not bad," he muttered, almost grudgingly. It wasn't praise, but it was recognition. Evan packed his things quietly, knowing that today had been a small victory. Walking out of the office, Evan reflected on the day. He had seen Dalton's true nature more clearly: his harshness, his favoritism, and his need to assert control. He had also observed the courage and resilience of his coworkers, many of whom endured daily stress quietly, doing their best despite the manager's constant criticism. Evan felt a mixture of concern and determination. He wanted to help, but he knew that change would require strategy, patience, and timing. On his way home, he thought about the subtle dynamics in the office, the fear, the quiet acts of solidarity among employees, and the way Dalton's behavior affected everyone, not just the ones he directly targeted. He realized that understanding these patterns was crucial if he wanted to make a positive impact later. For now, he focused on learning, observing, and quietly earning the trust of his colleagues. That evening, Evan reviewed the day in detail. He wrote down observations about Dalton, his colleagues, and the workflow. He noted patterns of behavior, the way employees reacted under pressure, and the moments when kindness or support made a difference. He thought about small ways he could make the office environment better without drawing attention. It was a delicate balance, but he was determined to succeed. As night fell, he felt a growing sense of purpose. The challenges were real. The office environment was tense. Dalton's presence was intimidating, but Evan knew that patience, observation, quiet courage would be his guiding principles. He understood that change would not happen overnight, but every small step he took could eventually make a meaningful difference. Evan drifted to sleep with a clear mind and a determined heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps even more intense than today, but he felt ready. He had learned that true strength lay not in confrontation, but in understanding, empathy, and resilience. The second day had tested him, but it had also reinforced his commitment to face the challenges ahead with patience, intelligence, and courage. The journey had just begun, and Evan knew that each day would teach him more about people, power, and the subtle ways in which respect, fear, and trust shaped the workplace. He was ready for whatever came next. The third day at the office began with the same tension, but there was an undercurrent of something different in the air. Evan felt it the moment he stepped into the building. There was a subtle buzz among the employees, a quiet anticipation mixed with caution. Perhaps it was the realization that some tasks were piling up. Or maybe it was the sense that Dalton's temper could reach new levels at any moment. Evan, however, felt calm. He had learned to read the office like a map, noticing the small patterns that revealed larger truths. Dalton arrived soon after, briskly walking into the room with his usual air of authority. He immediately started assigning tasks, his voice sharp and cutting. "I expect everyone to stay on top of their work today. Mistakes will not be tolerated. If you can't handle it, speak now." His eyes scanned the room like a hawk, landing briefly on Evan. "And you, new guy, don't think that being new will give you a pass." Evan nodded silently, showing neither fear nor defiance. The morning began with a flurry of activity. Dalton moved from desk to desk, inspecting work, correcting mistakes, and making sarcastic comments. "This report is sloppy," he snapped at one employee. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" Evan noticed the employee flinch, shrinking in their seat. The office was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the tapping of keyboards and the occasional muttered apology. Evan focused on his own work but paid close attention to how others reacted to Dalton. It was clear that fear had taken root. Some employees worked faster than usual, trying to avoid any chance of attracting negative attention. Others whispered quietly among themselves, sharing tips to avoid Dalton's wrath. Evan began to understand the subtle hierarchy in the office. just the official structure, but the invisible one created by fear, intimidation, and favoritism. Around mid-morning, Dalton assigned Evan a new Project One that required both strategy and initiative. It was the kind of assignment that could easily be mishandled by a new employee, but Evan approached it calmly. He reviewed every detail, made notes, and created a plan before starting. Dalton hovered nearby, occasionally making comments like, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Or "I wouldn't trust a new guy with this." Each time Evan responded politely, focusing on the task and refusing to show irritation, other employees began to notice. They glanced at him quietly, some with curiosity, others with a sense of hope. Perhaps someone could handle Dalton's pressure without breaking down. A few even whispered encouragement, though carefully, so Dalton wouldn't notice. Evan's calmness and competence were beginning to stand out, though he did nothing to draw attention to himself. He knew that true respect had to be earned, not demanded. By lunchtime, the tension in the office had grown. Dalton's behavior was harsher than before. He criticized minor mistakes publicly, raising his voice and making pointed comments that left employees embarrassed and anxious. Evan observed the reactions carefully. Some employees flinched, others tried to hide their frustration, and a few simply shut down, avoiding any interaction. It was clear that Dalton's behavior affected the entire office environment, not just the person he targeted. During lunch, Evan sat quietly in the cafeteria, eating slowly while observing the room. He noticed how employees navigated their interactions carefully, avoiding Dalton at all costs. He overheard fragments of conversation complaints about unfair treatment, frustration over unrealistic deadlines, and stories of favoritism. It was a silent but powerful insight into the human cost of Dalton's management style. Evan also noticed small acts of kindness and solidarity. A few employees shared tips quietly, helped each other with tasks, and offered encouragement without drawing Dalton's attention. These small gestures, almost invisible, showed that even under pressure, people were willing to support each other. Evan made a mental note of these dynamics, realizing that understanding these subtle interactions could be just as important as completing his own work. The afternoon brought a new challenge. Dalton assigned a critical project that required both accuracy and creativity. It was the kind of task that could easily become overwhelming, and Dalton's expectations were impossibly high. Evan approached the work methodically, breaking it down into manageable steps and checking every detail carefully.
Dalton watched
Over his shoulder, occasionally making cutting remarks or questioning his decisions. "Are you really qualified to handle this?" he asked, his tone sharp. Evan didn't react emotionally. He simply continued working efficiently, letting the results speak for themselves. As the project progressed, Dalton grew increasingly frustrated. He couldn't understand why Evan remained calm and competent under pressure. Every time Dalton tried to provoke a reaction, Evan responded politely and efficiently, completing tasks without complaint. Dalton's frustration became visible, his face reddening slightly as he muttered under his breath. Other employees noticed the tension, sensing that something unusual was happening. Evan was different from the rest. He was not intimidated. He did not seek approval. He simply performed his work with quiet determination. By mid-afternoon, Dalton's temper flared over a minor error made by another employee. His voice rose sharply, cutting across the office. "How could you make such a careless mistake? This is unacceptable." The employee looked down, embarrassed and anxious. Evan felt a pang of sympathy. He understood that Dalton's harshness wasn't just about mistakes. It was about asserting control and intimidating those around him. He quietly thought about ways he could help the team without drawing Dalton's attention. Evan decided to offer subtle support. When a coworker struggled with a task, he provided a quick tip or a discreet suggestion without attracting Dalton's notice. It was a delicate balance, helping others without drawing attention. But he realized that even small gestures could build trust and morale among his colleagues. Slowly, a quiet sense of hope began to emerge. Employees began to glance at him for guidance, though cautiously, afraid that Dalton might misinterpret their interactions. Dalton, meanwhile, continued to grow more irritated. He noticed Evan's composure and efficiency, but he couldn't understand it. Why is he so calm? Dalton muttered to himself. Why isn't he intimidated like the others? He questioned. Evan repeatedly, sometimes unnecessarily, attempting to provoke frustration or mistakes. Each time, Evan responded politely, finishing his work carefully and methodically. Dalton's growing confusion and frustration were becoming obvious to the rest of the office, though they remained silent. By the end of the day, Evan had completed all tasks efficiently, even identifying areas where improvements could be made. Dalton glanced at his work, clearly surprised. Not bad, he said, his tone grudging and almost reluctant. It wasn't praise, but it was recognition. Ben packed his things quietly, leaving the office without drawing attention. He felt a small sense of accomplishment. Today had been a subtle victory. He had maintained his composure, supported his coworkers, and completed his tasks effectively despite Dalton's harsh scrutiny. Walking home, Evan reflected on the day. He had seen Dalton's behavior more clearly than ever: his need for control, his harsh criticism, and his subtle favoritism. He had also observed the resilience of his colleagues, who endured daily stress quietly and supported each other in small, almost invisible ways. Evan felt a mixture of concern, empathy, and determination. He wanted to help, but he knew that change would require strategy, patience, and timing. Acting too soon could have negative consequences. So he focused on learning, observing, and quietly earning trust. That evening, Evan reviewed the day in detail. He wrote down his observations about Dalton, his colleagues, and the workflow. He noted patterns of behavior, the subtle ways fear and respect influenced interactions, and the small acts of kindness that kept morale alive. He thought about ways to help without provoking Dalton or disrupting the fragile balance in the office. Small steps, he realized, could eventually lead to meaningful change. Evan also reflected on his personal feelings. He was growing more aware of the impact a harsh manager could have on employees' confidence and well-being. He understood that true leadership wasn't about asserting authority through fear. It was about guiding, supporting, and inspiring people. He made a mental note to observe more, to document everything, and to look for opportunities to help his coworkers quietly. As night fell, Evan felt a quiet determination. The challenges in the office were real, the tension was high, and Dalton's behavior was intimidating, but he knew that patience, observation, and quiet courage would be his guiding principles. He understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small action he took could have a positive impact. Before going to sleep, he made a plan for the next day. He would continue to observe Dalton, support his colleagues discreetly, and maintain his own high standards of work. He would pay attention to the patterns in Dalton's behavior, the ways employees reacted under pressure, and the subtle dynamics that shaped the office environment. Each day would bring new lessons, and he was ready to learn from them. Evan drifted off to sleep with a sense of purpose. The third day had tested him, challenged him, taught him more about human behavior, power dynamics, and the subtle ways respect and fear influence the workplace. He knew that the next days would be even more revealing, and he was ready to face them with patience, intelligence, and courage. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring new opportunities. Perhaps Dalton's behavior would escalate, or perhaps the employees would begin to show more courage. Either way, Evan knew that he had to remain observant, calm, and strategic. The journey was far from over, but he felt more prepared than ever to navigate the complexities of office politics, hidden biases, and human behavior. The third day had ended, but the story was unfolding. Evan had learned more about Dalton, his colleagues, and the office environment. He had gained small victories, built quiet trust, and strengthened his resolve. He knew that the turning point was approaching, and he was ready to face it when it came. The fourth day at the office started like any other, but there was an unusual sense of anticipation in the air. Evan noticed it immediately. Employees moved with more energy than usual, yet there was a cautiousness to every step. Whispers filled the corners of the office, hushed conversations about deadlines, upcoming projects, and the relentless demands of Dalton. Evan settled into his seat, quietly observing, ready to see how the day would unfold. Dalton arrived earlier than usual, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he walked through the office. He carried a clipboard, tapping it occasionally with his pen. The manager's presence felt heavier than ever, and it was clear that everyone was on edge. "I expect everyone to give their best today," Dalton said, his tone brisk. "No excuses. I want to see results." His gaze lingered on Evan, measuring him, perhaps puzzled by his calm demeanor. The morning started with a series of challenging tasks. Dalton assigned projects that required focus, precision, and speed. He moved around the office, scrutinizing work, making sharp comments, and pushing employees to their limits. "This is not acceptable," he snapped at one employee. "Do it over and make sure it's perfect." Evan watched carefully, noticing the fear and hesitation in the other employee's body language. He understood that Dalton's harshness was not just about mistakes, it was about control, intimidation, and maintaining authority through fear. Evan focused on his own work, approaching each task methodically. Dalton hovered nearby, occasionally making cutting remarks. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, his tone filled with doubt. Evan responded calmly, continuing his work without hesitation. His quiet efficiency stood out, contrasting with the tense atmosphere Dalton had created. Other employees noticed, some with admiration, others with quiet envy. Around mid-morning, a new challenge arose. Dalton announced a surprise evaluation of a recent project. "I want to see the best work today," he said. "Everyone will be held accountable for mistakes, especially new employees. Don't let me down." Evan took a deep breath and reviewed his work carefully, making small adjustments and checking details. Dalton watched over his shoulder, attempting to provoke mistakes. But Evan remained composed. By lunchtime, the tension had become almost palpable. Dalton's behavior was harsher than ever, and employees whispered quietly about the manager's unreasonable demands. Some expressed frustration under their breath, while others simply tried to keep their heads down. Evan observed everything, noting patterns in Dalton's behavior, the subtle ways fear influenced interactions, and the moments when employees showed resilience despite pressure. In the cafeteria, Evan sat quietly with his lunch, observing the interactions around him. He noticed small gestures of support among employees, helping each other with minor tasks, sharing advice, or offering encouragement without attracting Dalton's attention. These quiet acts of kindness revealed the human side of the office, showing that even in a stressful environment, people could find ways to support each other. Evan felt a sense of responsibility growing inside him. He wanted to help, but he knew patience was essential. The afternoon brought a sudden change. An unexpected announcement echoed through the office. The CEO was visiting the department for a routine check. The news spread quickly, causing a mixture of excitement and anxiety among employees. Some straightened their desks and documents, while others whispered anxiously about what the CEO might observe. Dalton's eyes sharpened, and his pace became more rigid. He seemed determined to impress the CEO, perhaps using the opportunity to assert his authority further. Evan felt a mixture of curiosity and calm. The CEO's visit could change everything, and he knew that today might reveal more about Dalton's true character. He continued his work, making sure everything was in order, double-checking details and keeping his focus steady. He noticed how the employees adjusted their behavior, some trying to appear more efficient, others clearly nervous under Dalton's supervision. When the CEO arrived, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The room felt different, charged with attention and anticipation. The CEO walked through the office with a confident but approachable presence, greeting employees with a warm smile. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the operations and observing interactions. When he reached Evan, he paused, a look of recognition crossing his face. "Evan," he said warmly, calling him son. The words hung in the air. Dalton froze, realization dawning on him. The office fell silent, employees exchanging glances in disbelief. Dalton's expression shifted from authority to shock. He had been unaware of Evan's true identity, and the revelation hit him hard. The manager had bullied and disrespected someone he believed was a subordinate, only to discover that this person was the CEO's own son. Dalton struggled to regain composure, but the surprise was evident. Evan, however, remained calm. Meeting the CEO's gaze with respect and composure, the CEO asked Evan to step aside for a private conversation. In the quiet of a nearby office, Evan explained his experiences. He described Dalton's behavior, the fear it instilled in employees, and the subtle patterns of unfair treatment he had observed. He spoke honestly, calmly, and respectfully, highlighting both the challenges and the small moments of resilience he had noticed among his colleagues. The CEO listened intently, nodding occasionally, clearly taking in every detail. Meanwhile, Dalton's presence in the office became tense and awkward. Employees exchanged glances, aware that the manager's authority had been challenged in an unexpected way. Some whispered quietly, hoping for justice and change. The CEO returned to the main office after the conversation, addressing the team with a composed but firm tone. He acknowledged the hard work of the employees, praised their resilience, and announced that he had learned important information about the management practices in the department. Dalton was called aside privately, and a serious conversation took place. The CEO confronted him about his behavior, highlighting specific incidents of unfair treatment and disrespect. Dalton tried to defend himself, but the evidence in Evan's account made it clear that his conduct had caused significant harm to the team. The conversation ended with a firm warning and the understanding that Dalton's position was being carefully reviewed. Back in the office, employees felt a shift in the atmosphere. The CEO's presence and Evan's honesty had created a sense of accountability. Small gestures of encouragement among colleagues became more visible, and there was a renewed sense of hope. Employees began to speak more freely, sharing ideas and supporting each other with quiet confidence. Evan noticed the change, understanding that even subtle acts of courage and honesty could have a powerful impact. As the day progressed, Evan continued his work, maintaining his calm composure and efficiency. Dalton remained in the office but seemed subdued, aware that his actions had been scrutinized and that consequences were possible. The other employees, inspired by Evan's courage, quietly began to express themselves more openly, offering suggestions and collaborating with renewed energy. By the end of the day, Evan reflected on the events. The CEO's visit had revealed both the challenges and the opportunities within the office. Dalton's behavior had been exposed, and employees had seen that courage and honesty could lead to meaningful change. Evan felt a sense of quiet satisfaction knowing that his approach, patience, observation, and subtle support had contributed to this shift. Walking home, Evan thought about the lessons of the day. He had witnessed firsthand how authority could be misused, how fear could suppress talent, and how honesty and courage could inspire change. He also understood the importance of strategy, timing, and maintaining composure under pressure. Change was possible, but it required patience, careful observation, and the courage to act when the moment was right. That evening, Evan reviewed his notes, documenting every detail of the CEO's visit, Dalton's reactions, and the shifts in employee behavior. He reflected on the subtle dynamics of power, respect, and fear, and considered how to support his colleagues moving forward. He understood that while today had been a turning point, the work was far from over. Dalton's influence in the office culture would still require careful attention and thoughtful action. Before going to bed, Evan made a plan for the coming days. He would continue to observe, support his coworkers discreetly, and maintain his high standards of work. He would document patterns, note improvements, and look for opportunities to encourage fairness and respect. The CEO's visit had provided a glimpse of what was possible, but Evan knew that sustained change required continuous effort and careful navigation of office dynamics. Evan drifted off to sleep with a quiet sense of purpose. The fourth day had been pivotal. He had witnessed the consequences of honesty, courage, and careful observation. He had seen how authority could be challenged without confrontation, and how resilience and patience could inspire hope. He knew that the next days would bring new challenges, but he felt more prepared than ever to face them. The journey was far from over. Dalton's behavior, the office dynamics, and the subtle ways in which employees interacted would continue to provide lessons. Evan was ready to continue navigating this complex environment with patience, intelligence, and quiet courage. He understood that true change required more than immediate action. It required insight, empathy, and the ability to seize the right moment. The fourth day had ended, but the story was reaching a critical point. Evan had observed, learned, and acted with integrity, setting the stage for meaningful change. He knew that the turning point had arrived, and the coming days would determine how the office would respond, how Dalton's authority would be reshaped, and how courage and honesty could transform the workplace. The 5th day at the office started with a calm that felt unusual. The tension from previous days was still there, but something had shifted. Employees moved with more confidence, their interactions quieter, yet more genuine. Evan could sense it immediately. The CEO's visit the day before had created ripples through the department, and Dalton's sudden awareness of his mistakes had changed the office atmosphere, though subtly. It was a new beginning, and the air felt lighter, even if the underlying challenges remained. Evan arrived early, as usual, making sure everything on his desk was organized and ready. He had a routine note-reviewing, notes from the previous days, observing the employees, and quietly analyzing Dalton's behavior. The office doors opened, and employees trickled in, some greeting each other with small smiles, others still cautious but relieved. Evan noticed how the smallest gestures, like a nod or a quiet good morning, had started to rebuild trust and morale in the team. Dalton appeared shortly after, his usual sharp expression replaced by a tighter, almost defensive one. He moved through the office, but Evan noticed he seemed quieter, less assertive, and more hesitant than before. The manager had clearly realized the impact of the CEO's visit, and for the first time, he wasn't the center of fear. He was being watched, perhaps judged, by the very team he had mistreated. Dalton began assigning tasks, but his tone lacked the usual sharpness. He still gave instructions, but there was a caution in his words, a recognition that his actions were under scrutiny. The morning started with a series of challenging tasks. Evan approached them as usual, calmly analyzing each assignment, breaking it into manageable steps, and completing it with precision. He wants to see how far he can go before you break. Evan nodded slightly but said nothing. He had made a conscious decision to learn quietly, to observe, and to understand the office dynamics before taking any action. Dalton hovered nearby, attempting to make remarks that would provoke him. But Evan responded politely, efficiently, and without reaction. The other employees noticed his steady demeanor, and a quiet admiration began to build. It was clear that Evan had earned respect not through position, but through consistent action and integrity. Around mid-morning, an incident occurred that would mark a subtle turning point. One of the employees, clearly nervous, made a minor mistake on a report. Normally, Dalton would have raised his voice, perhaps even publicly embarrassed the employee. But today, something was different. Dalton paused, glanced at Evan, and then quietly corrected the mistake without any harsh words. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. The employees noticed. The fear that had permeated the office began to ebb slightly, replaced by a sense of cautious relief. Evan continued his work, maintaining his focus and observing the subtle changes in the office dynamics. He noticed how employees began to communicate more openly, asking questions, sharing tips, and supporting each other in small ways. It was almost invisible, but the culture was beginning to shift. Evan realized that leadership and influence didn't always come from confrontation. It could come quietly, through example, patience, and consistent integrity. By lunchtime, the office felt calmer. Employees gathered in small groups, chatting quietly about their work, sharing experiences, and even smiling without fear of Dalton's judgment. Evan joined a few colleagues at a table, listening to their thoughts and gently encouraging them. They spoke candidly about the challenges of the past days, the fear they had endured, and the small victories they had achieved despite Dalton's harshness. Evan offered quiet advice, emphasizing patience, observation, and careful action. His calm presence seemed to reassure them. A subtle sense of camaraderie began to form. The afternoon brought a more significant development. The CEO decided to extend his visit, checking in on the department once more. This time, he observed the interactions between employees, noting the subtle changes that had occurred since his last visit. Dalton, still aware of the scrutiny, moved carefully, assigning tasks and giving instructions with measured words. The CEO watched Evan work alongside his colleagues, noting how he supported them quietly, encouraged their ideas, and maintained composure under pressure. It was a living example of the leadership and empathy he valued. After the observations, the CEO called a brief meeting in the conference room. Employees gathered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, nervousness, and anticipation. Dalton stood at the edge, unsure of how this would unfold. The CEO began by acknowledging the hard work of the team, praising their resilience and dedication despite the challenges they faced. He highlighted the importance of a positive work environment, mutual respect, and fair treatment. Then, turning to Evan, he spoke directly. Your honesty, patience, and approach to supporting your colleagues have been remarkable. You've shown us all how leadership can be quiet, effective, and empowering. Evan listened respectfully, nodding. He understood that this acknowledgement was not about personal praise, but about reinforcing the values he had demonstrated. The CEO then addressed Dalton privately, citing specific examples of unfair treatment, disrespect, and favoritism that had been observed. Dalton attempted to defend himself, but quickly realized that the evidence in Evan's account left little room for justification. The conversation ended with a clear message: change was necessary, and accountability would be enforced. Back in the office, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Dalton returned, his usual authority tempered by awareness and caution. The employees began to engage more openly, sharing ideas, collaborating, and supporting each other without fear of harsh reprimand. Evan continued to guide subtly, offering advice and encouragement when needed, but always with discretion. It was clear that the culture of fear was slowly being replaced by a culture of respect and collaboration. Throughout the rest of the day, Evan focused on completing his tasks, supporting his colleagues, and observing the ongoing changes. He noticed small improvements: employees speaking up, sharing feedback, and assisting one another more willingly. Even Dalton, while still present, seemed more restrained. Aware that his previous behavior had consequences, and that the CEO was observing the environment carefully, the subtle transformation was inspiring. By the end of the day, Evan reflected on the journey. The past days had been challenging, filled with tension, observation, and subtle strategies to support his colleagues. But today had shown that change was possible. The CEO's involvement, combined with Evan's quiet leadership and patience, had begun to shift the office culture. Fear was being replaced by cautious confidence, and employees were beginning to see that fairness, respect, and integrity mattered more than intimidation or harsh authority. Walking home, Evan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had witnessed the power of patience, observation, and quiet action. He had seen how consistent integrity could inspire change, even in the face of entrenched fear and authority. He thought about the employees who had endured so much, and how small acts of support and courage could make a significant difference in their lives. That evening, Evan reviewed his notes, documenting the changes he had observed. Dalton's altered behavior and the growing confidence among his colleagues. He reflected on the importance of empathy, patience, and careful strategy in creating meaningful change. He knew that while the transformation was still ongoing, the foundation had been laid. The office environment was improving. Employees were beginning to experience a sense of empowerment and respect that had been missing for so long. Evan also considered his personal growth. These past days had taught him about leadership, human behavior, and the subtle dynamics of power and influence. He had learned that true courage wasn't always about confrontation. It could be quiet, consistent, and strategic. Supporting others, observing carefully, maintaining composure were powerful tools that could create lasting impact before going to sleep. Evan made a plan for the future. He would continue to observe, support his colleagues, and encourage a culture of fairness and respect. He would document progress, identify areas for improvement, look for opportunities to help the office continue its transformation. He understood that change required continuous effort, empathy, and courage. But he felt confident in the approach he had developed. Evan drifted off to sleep with a sense of accomplishment and purpose. The fifth day had been a turning point. The CEO's visit had reinforced accountability. Dalton's behavior had been challenged, and employees had begun to experience a safer, more respectful environment. The journey had been difficult, but it had shown the power of patience, honesty, and quiet leadership. The story had reached a satisfying conclusion. Dalton had faced consequences for his actions. The office culture had begun to shift, and Evan's approach had inspired confidence and change among his colleagues. The lessons learned about empathy, integrity, courage, and patience would continue to guide him in future challenges. Evan knew that the journey wasn't over. Maintaining a positive environment required ongoing effort, careful observation, and consistent support. But he also knew that meaningful change was possible, and that the quiet, patient actions of one person could inspire a ripple effect throughout an organization. The fifth day ended with hope, growth, and a sense of accomplishment. Evan had witnessed the impact of integrity, courage, and empathy in a challenging environment. He had supported his colleagues, navigated complex office dynamics, helped create a culture where respect and fairness could thrive. It was a story of quiet strength, patience, and the power of positive action in the face of adversity.